12 Baby found Mother Bear, running forest counseling service for traumatized animals. What she did put everyone in tears. The morning mist hung low between the towering pines, creating a veil that made the forest look like something from another world. Ethan Marshall had been a forest ranger for 15 years, and in all that time, he had never experienced anything quite like what he was feeling that September morning. His boots pressed softly against the damp earth as he moved through a section of the woods he knew better than the lines on his own hands. But something was different today. The usual symphony of bird calls that greeted him every morning had vanished. The chattering of squirrels, the distant drumming of woodpeckers, even the subtle rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, all of it had been replaced by a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. It wasn't the threatening kind of quiet that preceded a storm or signaled the presence of a predator. This was something else entirely. A hush that seemed to pulse with an invisible energy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ethan paused beside an ancient oak tree, its trunk so wide that 3 men holding hands couldn't wrap their arms around it. He placed his palm against the rough bark, feeling the dampness from the morning dew seep through his work gloves. The texture was familiar, grounding him in the moment, but the atmosphere around him remained surreal. He had walked these trails countless times, responding to reports of injured hikers, tracking wildlife populations, clearing fallen trees after storms. Each visit had its own rhythm, its own soundtrack of nature's daily business. But today, the forest seemed to be keeping a secret, and Ethan found himself drawn deeper into the woods, following an instinct he couldn't quite name. The path curved ahead, disappearing into a grove of younger trees where the canopy grew thicker, blocking out most of the early morning light. Normally, this would be where he'd hear the territorial calls of jays or the scurrying of chipmunks gathering their morning meal. Instead, there was only that profound quiet, broken occasionally by the sound of his own breathing and the soft crunch of pine needles beneath his feet. Then, just as he was about to turn back and report the unusual conditions to his supervisor, he heard it. A sound so out of place in these woods that for a moment he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. It was a soft, contented coo, the unmistakable sound of a human baby. Ethan froze, his hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his belt. There had been no reports of missing children in the area. The nearest campground was miles away, and the hiking trails that families frequented were on the other side of the ridge. Yet there it was again, that gentle babbling that could only come from an infant. Moving with the careful precision of someone who had spent years navigating the wilderness, Ethan followed the sound, each step deliberate and silent. The cooing grew clearer as he approached a small clearing he had passed through hundreds of times before. But when he finally pushed aside the low-hanging branches and stepped into the open space, what he saw made him question everything he thought he knew about the natural world. There, at the base of a massive pine tree, nestled in what looked like a carefully arranged bed of moss and fallen leaves, was a baby. She couldn't have been more than 6 months old, with wisps of dark hair and chubby cheeks flushed pink from the cool morning air. She was wrapped in what appeared to be a hand-knitted blanket, pale yellow with tiny flowers embroidered along the edges. But it wasn't the presence of the baby that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. It was what sat beside her. A massive brown bear, easily 8 feet tall if she were standing, was settled on her haunches just inches from the infant. The bear's enormous paw rested gently near the baby's blanket, not touching, but positioned as if ready to provide comfort if needed. The bear's eyes, dark and intelligent, were fixed on the child with an expression that Ethan could only describe as maternal tenderness. Ethan's training screamed at him to act, to radio for backup, to somehow get between the bear and the baby. Bears were dangerous, unpredictable creatures, especially when they felt their territory was threatened. But something in the bear's posture, in the way she sat so perfectly still, made him hesitate. This wasn't the aggressive stance of a bear protecting its cubs or defending a food source. This was something else entirely. The bear's breathing was slow and rhythmic, almost meditative, and her gaze never wavered from the baby, who was reaching up with tiny fingers, grasping at the air as if trying to touch the morning light filtering through the trees. As Ethan stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, he began to notice other details that made the scene even more surreal. Around the perimeter of the clearing, partially hidden in the shadows of the trees, were other animals. A doe stood motionless near a cluster of ferns, her usual flight instinct seemingly suspended. 2 foxes sat side by side, their russet fur catching the occasional beam of sunlight, their attention fixed on the center of the clearing. Even a family of raccoons had emerged from their daytime hiding spots, sitting in a row like attendees at some strange woodland ceremony. None of them showed any sign of fear or aggression. They all seemed to be waiting, watching, as if they understood something that Ethan was only beginning to grasp. The baby gurgled happily, kicking her little legs beneath the blanket, completely unaware of how extraordinary her situation was. The bear shifted slightly, lowering her massive head until her nose was just inches from the infant. Ethan tensed, ready to shout, to throw something, to do whatever it took to distract the bear. But then the bear did something that defied every piece of knowledge Ethan had accumulated about wildlife behavior. She exhaled softly, a warm breath that ruffled the baby's hair, and the infant laughed. A pure, delighted sound that seemed to ripple through the clearing like a stone dropped in still water. The other animals stirred slightly, as if the baby's joy had touched them somehow, but they maintained their vigil. Ethan slowly, carefully, reached for the small notebook he always carried in his chest pocket. His hands trembled slightly as he began to document what he was seeing, knowing that no one would believe him without evidence. He noted the time, 7:23 a.m., and began sketching the positions of the animals, the way the morning light created an almost ethereal glow around the scene. His pencil moved across the paper in quick, practiced strokes, capturing details he knew his camera couldn't adequately convey. The bear's eyes had a quality to them that no photograph could capture, a depth of understanding that seemed almost human. As he watched and drew, Ethan began to notice a pattern in the animal's behavior. Every few minutes, one of them would approach the center of the clearing, moving with a deliberate slowness that suggested respect rather than caution. A squirrel with a visibly injured tail limped forward, chittering softly. The bear turned her attention to the small creature, lowering her head until they were eye to eye. For a long moment, they remained perfectly still, and then something remarkable happened. The squirrel's tense posture relaxed, its tail stopped twitching erratically, and it settled into a calm stillness Ethan had never seen in such a typically hyperactive animal. After a few minutes, the squirrel retreated to the edge of the clearing, but instead of leaving, it found a spot among the roots of a tree, and stayed, as if it had found some kind of peace it didn't want to leave behind. The baby continued to coo and babble throughout these exchanges, her tiny voice providing a strange soundtrack to the proceedings. Sometimes she would laugh, that infectious baby giggle that seemed to make even the trees lean in closer. Other times she would make soft, soothing sounds, as if she were trying to communicate with the creatures around her. The bear never moved far from the infant's side, maintaining her protective position while somehow also serving as what Ethan could only describe as a counselor to the forest's inhabitants. A crow with a drooping wing hopped into the clearing next, cawing weakly. Birds rarely showed such vulnerability in the open, especially around predators. But this crow seemed to know it was safe here. The bear observed the bird with those impossibly knowing eyes, and without any physical contact, without any sound Ethan could hear, something passed between them. The crow's cawing quieted, its wing tucked more comfortably against its body, and it too found a perch where it could remain in the clearing's peaceful atmosphere. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was witnessing. He had studied animal behavior, had read countless research papers on interspecies interaction, but nothing in his education or experience had prepared him for this. This wasn't just a bear that had found a human baby, though that alone would have been extraordinary enough. This was something that challenged the very foundations of what he understood about the natural world. The bear seemed to be providing some kind of emotional support to the other animals, and the baby's presence appeared to be amplifying whatever mysterious healing was taking place. The sun climbed higher, sending shafts of golden light through the canopy, and still the strange gathering continued. More animals arrived. A rabbit with a pronounced limp, a young deer with scars across its flank, even a porcupine that moved with unusual slowness. Each one approached the bear, spent time in her presence, and then retreated to join the growing circle of creatures that seemed reluctant to leave the clearing. The baby had fallen into a peaceful sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with the bear's own breathing, as if they had synchronized somehow. Ethan knew he should report this immediately. There was a baby in the forest, presumably lost or abandoned, and every protocol demanded that he call it in. But something held him back. This wasn't a crisis, at least not in any conventional sense. The baby was safe, perhaps safer than she would be anywhere else, surrounded by a guardian more devoted than any he had ever seen. And there was something else, something harder to define. The clearing felt sacred, like he had stumbled upon a ceremony that had been taking place long before humans walked these woods. To interrupt it felt wrong on a level that went beyond professional duty. His notebook was filling up with observations, sketches, and questions he couldn't begin to answer. How long had this been going on? Where had the baby come from? How had the bear found her? And more importantly, why had the bear chosen to protect her rather than see her as a threat or, worse, as prey? And what about the other animals? Their behavior suggested this wasn't the first time they had gathered here, that somehow they knew this bear, trusted her in a way that defied every survival instinct evolution had given them. The baby stirred in her sleep, making small sucking motions with her mouth. The bear noticed immediately, her large head tilting with what could only be described as concern. Then, in a movement so gentle it seemed impossible for a creature of her size, the bear used her nose to adjust the blanket that had slipped from the baby's shoulder. The tenderness of the gesture made Ethan's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He had seen mother bears with their cubs, had witnessed the fierce protectiveness and care they showed their young. But this was different. This was a bear caring for a human child with a deliberateness that suggested not just instinct, but choice. As the morning wore on, Ethan noticed that the atmosphere in the clearing was beginning to shift. The animals that had arrived injured or distressed seemed calmer now, their breathing slower, their postures more relaxed. Some had even begun to groom themselves or each other, a sign of comfort and security that would normally never happen in such a mixed gathering of species. The baby woke briefly, her eyes opening to focus on the bear's face with a recognition that suggested this wasn't their first encounter. She reached out with one chubby hand, her fingers grasping at the air between them, and the bear leaned down just enough for the baby's hand to brush against her fur. The touch lasted only a second, but the baby smiled and settled back into sleep, apparently satisfied. Ethan had filled one notebook and started on another, his hand cramping from continuous writing. But he couldn't stop documenting what he was seeing. Every detail felt important, every moment a piece of a puzzle he might never fully solve. He noted how the light in the clearing seemed different from the surrounding forest, softer somehow, as if filtered through an invisible veil. He wrote about the way the usual forest sounds, the ones that had been absent when he arrived, seemed to stop at the edge of the clearing, like they couldn't penetrate whatever barrier of peace had been established here. A movement to his left caught his attention, and he turned to see a young fox approaching, but this one was different from the others. It moved with a pronounced limp, favoring its right front paw, and its eyes held a wariness that spoke of recent trauma. The fox paused at the edge of the clearing, its body tense, ready to flee at the slightest threat. The bear noticed the newcomer immediately, her dark eyes shifting to observe the injured creature. She made no movement toward it, showed no sign of aggression or even particular interest, but something in her steady gaze seemed to communicate safety. The fox took a tentative step forward, then another, its injured paw barely touching the ground. The other animals watched but didn't react, as if they understood this was part of the process, whatever that process was. The baby was awake again now, her bright eyes following the fox's slow progress toward the center of the clearing. When the fox was just a few feet away, it stopped, its whole body trembling with the effort of fighting against its instinct to run. The bear remained perfectly still, but Ethan could see something happening in the space between them, an exchange he couldn't define but could somehow feel. The baby made a soft, encouraging sound, almost like she was trying to soothe the frightened animal. The fox's ears swiveled toward the sound, and for a moment its trembling eased. Then, in a movement that seemed to surprise even the fox itself, it lay down, its injured paw stretched out in front of it, its head resting on its uninjured leg. The bear continued to watch, her presence a constant calming force, and gradually the fox's breathing slowed. Its eyes lost some of their wild fear, and it seemed to sink into the same peaceful state that had overtaken the other animals. Ethan realized he had been holding his breath and released it slowly, afraid that even that small sound might disturb the scene. He glanced at his watch and was shocked to see that nearly 3 hours had passed since he first entered the clearing. The outside world, with all its demands and protocols, seemed very far away. He knew he would have to leave soon, would have to make decisions about what to do with this information, but for now, he couldn't bring himself to move. The baby was fully awake now, making happy babbling sounds that seemed to delight the assembled animals. Some of them had moved closer, forming a tighter circle around the bear and the infant, while others maintained their distance but showed no signs of leaving. The bear occasionally would turn her attention to one animal or another, always with that same steady, knowing gaze that seemed to communicate something beyond Ethan's understanding. And through it all, the baby remained the calm center, her presence somehow essential to whatever was happening here. As the sun reached its zenith, casting the clearing in bright, dappled light, Ethan noticed something new. The animals were beginning to interact with each other in ways that should have been impossible. The rabbit was sitting near one of the foxes, close enough that they were almost touching. The crow had hopped down from its perch and was pecking at seeds near the porcupine, showing no fear of the creature's quills. Even the deer had moved closer to the group, its usual vigilance replaced by an almost drowsy contentment. It was as if the bear's presence, combined with the baby's innocent joy, had created a temporary suspension of the natural order, a bubble of peace in a world usually governed by survival and fear. The baby laughed again, a sound of pure delight that seemed to ripple through the clearing like a wave. Several of the animals turned toward the sound, and Ethan could have sworn he saw something like affection in their eyes. The bear leaned down once more, her massive head hovering protectively over the infant, and made a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't quite a purr either. It was a sound Ethan had never heard a bear make before, something between contentment and communication, and the baby responded by reaching up both arms as if asking to be held. For a moment, Ethan thought the bear might actually try to pick up the baby, and his hand moved instinctively toward his radio. But the bear simply lowered her head until her nose touched the baby's outstretched hands, allowing the tiny fingers to explore the texture of her fur. The baby squealed with delight, her whole body wiggling with excitement, and the sound seemed to lift the spirits of every creature in the clearing. Even Ethan found himself smiling, despite the surreal nature of what he was witnessing. As he continued to observe and document, Ethan began to develop a theory, though it seemed too fantastic to be real. What if the bear had somehow discovered that she could help other animals process trauma and fear? What if this clearing had become a kind of sanctuary, a place where the usual rules of predator and prey were suspended in favor of something more important: healing? And what if the baby's presence had somehow enhanced this ability, her innocent joy and complete lack of fear creating an atmosphere where even the most traumatized creatures could find peace? The thought led to more questions than answers. How had the bear discovered this ability? Was it learned or instinctual? And most pressingly, how had a human baby come to be part of this? Ethan studied the infant more closely, looking for any signs of distress or neglect, but she appeared well fed and cared for. Her clothes, while somewhat dirty from being in the forest, were of good quality and relatively clean. The blanket she was wrapped in showed signs of repeated washing and careful mending. Someone had loved this child, had cared for her, which made her presence here even more mysterious. A rustling from the opposite side of the clearing drew his attention, and Ethan watched as a new arrival made its way into the sacred space. This time, it was a mother raccoon, but she wasn't alone. Clutched against her chest, carried with obvious difficulty, was a young kit that appeared to be either sick or injured. The kit's eyes were closed, its body limp, and Ethan's heart sank as he realized it might be too late for whatever healing this place could offer. The mother raccoon's movements were desperate but determined, and the other animals parted to let her through, as if they understood the urgency of her mission. The bear's attention immediately focused on the new arrivals, her dark eyes taking in the situation with what Ethan could only describe as comprehension. The mother raccoon approached slowly, her body language a mixture of hope and fear, until she was just a few feet from the bear. Then, in a gesture that made Ethan's throat tighten with emotion, she gently placed her kit on the soft moss near the baby's blanket and stepped back, her eyes never leaving her young one. The clearing seemed to hold its breath. Even the baby had gone quiet, her large eyes fixed on the small, still form of the kit. The bear lowered her massive head, sniffing gently at the young raccoon, her breath warm and careful. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Ethan found himself silently willing the kit to move, to show some sign of life. Then the bear did something extraordinary. She lay down, her huge body creating a protective curve around both the baby and the kit, and began to hum, a low, thrumming sound that seemed to come from deep within her chest. The sound was unlike anything Ethan had ever heard from a bear. It was almost melodic, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed deliberate rather than random. The baby responded immediately, her own voice joining in with happy coos and babbles that somehow harmonized with the bear's humming. The combination created a strange but beautiful sound that filled the clearing, and Ethan watched in amazement as the other animals began to sway slightly, as if moved by the unusual music. The mother raccoon crept closer, her eyes fixed on her kit, and Ethan saw the moment when hope flickered in her gaze. The kit's tiny paw had twitched just barely, but it was movement. The bear continued her humming, the baby continued her happy sounds. And gradually, impossibly, the kit began to stir. Its eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening as it became aware of its surroundings. The mother raccoon made a soft chittering sound, and her kit responded weakly but unmistakably. Ethan realized he was witnessing something that went beyond simple animal behavior, beyond anything that science could easily explain. This was something older, deeper, a connection between living things that transcended species and spoke to something fundamental about consciousness and compassion. The bear had somehow become a healer, a counselor to the traumatized and injured creatures of the forest, and the human baby had become part of that healing process in a way that defied all logic. As the kit grew stronger, eventually managing to crawl back to its mother, Ethan saw tears in his own reflection in his watch face and realized he was crying. The emotion of the moment, the pure, uncomplicated love and care being displayed, had overwhelmed his scientific detachment. He had spent years in these woods, had thought he understood them, but this was showing him how much mystery remained, how much magic still existed in the world if one knew where to look. The afternoon was beginning to wane, and Ethan knew that soon he would have to make a decision. The baby couldn't stay in the forest forever, no matter how well protected she seemed to be. There would be parents somewhere, terrified and searching. There would be questions that needed answers, authorities that needed to be notified. But how could he explain what he had seen? How could he make anyone understand that this wasn't a dangerous situation, but something precious and rare that needed to be protected? As if sensing his thoughts, the bear raised her head and looked directly at him for the first time. Ethan's breath caught as those ancient, knowing eyes met his. He had been so careful to remain hidden, to observe without interfering. But of course the bear had known he was there all along. Every animal in the clearing had probably known, but they had allowed him to watch, to witness, as if understanding that their story needed to be told, even if few would believe it. The bear held his gaze for a long moment, and in that exchange, Ethan felt something pass between them. Not quite communication, but understanding. The bear knew what he was, knew that he represented the human world that would eventually intrude on this sacred space. But there was no hostility in her gaze, only a kind of sad acceptance, as if she knew that this magical moment was temporary, that soon the outside world would come crashing in. The baby had fallen asleep again, peaceful and content in the protection of her unusual guardian. The animals in the clearing had settled into a comfortable community, predator and prey side by side, their usual fears and conflicts suspended in this bubble of peace. And Ethan stood at the edge of it all, notebook clutched in his hand, trying to decide what to do with the impossible truth he had discovered. He thought about his colleague, Lily Morgan, a wildlife biologist who worked at the research station on the other side of the forest. Lily was brilliant, but also open-minded, willing to consider possibilities that others might dismiss. If anyone could help him understand what was happening here, and more importantly, help him protect it, it would be Lily. But even as he thought about bringing someone else into this secret, he worried about disturbing the delicate balance that had been achieved. The bear seemed to sense his indecision. She made that low rumbling sound again, the one that wasn't quite a growl, and somehow Ethan understood it as permission. She was telling him it was okay to bring help, that she understood the baby couldn't stay forever, that the human world had claims that even she, with all her mysterious power, couldn't deny. The realization that he was interpreting the communications of a wild bear should have seemed insane, but after everything he had witnessed, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Ethan slowly backed away from the clearing, moving with careful steps to avoid disturbing the peace. As he retreated into the darker forest, he took one last look at the scene. The bear standing guard, the baby sleeping peacefully. The assembled animals in their impossible harmony. He tried to burn the image into his memory, knowing that even with his detailed notes and sketches, he would never be able to fully capture the magic of what he had seen. The walk back to his truck seemed to take forever, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. He would contact Lily first, convince her to come with him before alerting anyone else. Together, they could document what was happening, could maybe find a way to protect the clearing while still ensuring the baby's safe return to her family. It would require delicacy and probably some creative interpretation of regulations, but Ethan was willing to risk his career if it meant preserving something this extraordinary. As he reached his vehicle and pulled out his phone, Ethan saw that he had dozens of missed calls and messages. His supervisor, other rangers, even some local police numbers. His heart sank as he realized the search for the baby must have already begun. He scrolled through the messages quickly, gathering information. A 6-month-old infant, Emma was her name, had disappeared from a campsite nearly 10 miles away. The parents were distraught. Search parties were being organized, and every available ranger was being called in to help. Ethan sat in his truck for a moment, phone in hand, weighing his options. He could call it in right now, direct the search parties to the clearing, and have Emma reunited with her parents within the hour. It would be the right thing to do by every conventional measure. But something held him back. The clearing wasn't just about the baby anymore. It was about the bear and her mysterious ability to heal, about the traumatized animals finding peace, about a miracle that the modern world would probably destroy in its rush to understand and control. Finally, he dialed Lily's number, relief flooding through him when she answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm and familiar, tinged with the slight accent she had retained from her childhood in Ireland. Ethan had worked with her on several research projects over the years, and he trusted her judgment more than anyone else in his professional circle. If anyone could help him navigate this situation, it would be Lily. He chose his words carefully, not wanting to sound insane over the phone. He told her he had found something extraordinary in the forest, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about animal behavior. He mentioned the missing baby, said she was safe, but that the situation was complicated in ways he couldn't explain over the phone. He asked her to come alone, to trust him, and to bring her camera and recording equipment. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Lily agreed, her curiosity obviously piqued by his unusual request. As Ethan waited for Lily to arrive, he reviewed his notes, trying to organize his observations into something coherent. But how did one describe a bear providing emotional counseling to forest animals? How did one explain a human baby serving as some kind of amplifier for interspecies healing? The more he tried to make sense of it rationally, the more impossible it seemed. Yet he had seen it with his own eyes, had documented every detail. It was real, even if it defied explanation. Lily arrived within an hour, her small hybrid car pulling up beside his truck with barely a sound. She emerged with her usual efficiency, her research backpack already strapped on, her camera hanging around her neck. Her red hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes were bright with curiosity and a hint of concern. She had known Ethan long enough to recognize when something had truly shaken him, and his voice on the phone had clearly conveyed that this was one of those times. Ethan handed her his notebooks without preamble, watching her expression change as she read through his observations. Her initial skepticism gradually gave way to intrigue, then to an excitement he rarely saw in her usually composed demeanor. She looked up at him several times as if to confirm he was serious, and each time he simply nodded. When she finished reading, she was quiet for a long moment, processing what he had documented. The walk back to the clearing was conducted in near silence, both of them moving carefully through the forest as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees. Ethan could feel the same unusual quiet settling over them as they approached, the normal forest sounds fading away like someone slowly turning down the volume on the world. Lily noticed it too, her steps slowing, her head tilting as she listened to the absence of sound. When they finally reached the edge of the clearing, Ethan heard Lily's sharp intake of breath. The scene had changed somewhat in his absence. Some animals had left while others had arrived, but the central tableau remained the same. The bear still stood guard over the baby, who was now awake and playing with her own feet, giggling at some baby joke only she understood. The assembled animals still maintained their peaceful vigil, and the atmosphere of calm healing remained as strong as ever. Lily stood frozen beside him, her scientific mind clearly struggling to process what her eyes were showing her. She raised her camera automatically, then lowered it, as if recognizing that no photograph could capture what they were witnessing. Instead, she pulled out her own notebook and began writing furiously, her trained eye catching details that even Ethan had missed. She noted the specific species present, their body language, the unusual spatial arrangements that suggested suspended territorial boundaries. They watched together as another healing session took place, this time with an elderly owl whose wing hung at an awkward angle. The bird had probably been injured for some time, the wing healed incorrectly, leaving it unable to fly properly. The bear's attention fixed on the owl with that same intense, knowing gaze, and the baby seemed to sense the importance of the moment, her babbling taking on a soothing, almost musical quality. The owl remained still for long minutes, and while its wing didn't magically heal, something in its posture changed, a tension releasing that suggested the easing of chronic pain. Lily grabbed Ethan's arm, her fingers tight with excitement. She whispered observations in his ear, pointing out subtle behaviors he had missed. Connections between the animals that suggested a complex social dynamic that shouldn't exist. She was particularly fascinated by the baby's role, noting how the infant seemed to respond to each animal's distress with different vocalizations, as if she somehow understood what each creature needed. As the sun began to sink lower, painting the clearing in golden light, they witnessed something new. The bear stood up on her hind legs, her full height impressive and somewhat terrifying, even from a distance. But there was nothing aggressive in the gesture. Instead, she seemed to be scanning the forest beyond the clearing, her nose testing the air. Then she dropped back to all fours and made a series of soft woofing sounds that Ethan had never heard before. The animals in the clearing began to stir, not in alarm, but with what seemed like understanding. One by one, they began to leave, each pausing to look back at the bear and the baby before disappearing into the forest. It was like watching the end of a church service, each congregant taking their peace with them as they returned to their daily lives. Soon, only a few remained, the most injured or traumatized, apparently needing more time in the healing presence. The baby yawned, her little face scrunching up in the universal expression of infant tiredness. The bear immediately noticed, adjusting the blanket around the child with that same impossible gentleness. Then she settled down beside the baby, her massive body creating a warm, protective barrier against the cooling evening air. The baby's eyes drooped, and within minutes she was asleep, one tiny hand resting against the bear's fur. Lily finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She told Ethan that in all her years of studying animal behavior, she had never seen anything that came close to this. She talked about the implications, the way it challenged fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness, empathy, and interspecies communication. But she also understood the danger, the way the scientific community would react, the media circus that would ensue if this became public knowledge. They discussed options in hushed tones, aware that the search parties would be expanding their radius, that time was running out before this sacred space was discovered by others who might not understand its significance. Lily suggested they needed more documentation, more evidence, before they could even begin to think about how to protect what was happening here. But they also couldn't leave a baby in the forest indefinitely, no matter how well protected she seemed to be. As darkness began to fall, they made the difficult decision to return to Ethan's truck and plan their next move. They would come back at first light with better equipment, would try to document as much as possible before the inevitable happened. They both knew the clearing's days of peace were numbered, that soon the human world would intrude with all its noise and chaos. But maybe, if they were careful and clever, they could preserve something of what they had witnessed. The walk back through the darkening forest was somber, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Ethan kept thinking about the bear's eyes, the depth of intelligence and compassion he had seen there. Lily was already planning her research approach, the papers she would write, the careful way she would need to present this to avoid ridicule while still conveying the magnitude of what they had discovered. As they reached the truck, they could see lights in the distance, flashlights from search parties combing the forest for the missing baby. The outside world was closing in, and they both felt the weight of responsibility for what happened next. They had stumbled upon something miraculous, something that proved the natural world still held mysteries beyond human understanding. Now, they had to figure out how to protect it, how to honor it, while still ensuring a baby's safe return to her family. Lily spent the night at the research station, gathering equipment and reviewing her notes, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. She pulled up every study she could find on interspecies interaction, on animal consciousness, on the role of infants in mammalian bonding. Nothing came close to explaining what they had seen, but she began to build a theoretical framework that might at least make it comprehensible to other scientists. Ethan, meanwhile, returned to his cabin and spent hours transcribing his notes, adding details he remembered, trying to capture not just what had happened but how it had felt. The peace of the clearing, the sense of ancient wisdom in the bear's presence, the pure joy of the baby that seemed to heal wounds that went deeper than flesh. He knew that no matter how carefully they documented this, something essential would be lost in the translation from experience to evidence. They met again before dawn, loading Lily's car with cameras, recording equipment, and various instruments for measuring everything from electromagnetic fields to pheromone levels. They both knew it was probably futile, that whatever was happening in the clearing wouldn't be captured by their human tools, but they had to try. The scientific method was all they had to offer as a bridge between the miraculous and the mundane. The forest was still dark as they made their way back, their flashlights creating dancing shadows among the trees. The usual pre-dawn chorus of birds was beginning, but it faded as they approached the clearing, that same supernatural quiet settling over them like a blanket. They paused at the edge, letting their eyes adjust to the dim light, and what they saw made them both catch their breath. The clearing was full of animals, more than either of them had seen during their previous observations. They were arranged in concentric circles around the bear and the baby, like an audience at an amphitheater. There were species that rarely tolerated each other's presence: hawks perched near mice, foxes sitting beside rabbits, even a young mountain lion at the outer edge, its usual predatory instincts seemingly suspended. And at the center the bear sat upright, the baby cradled in the curve of her massive arm, both of them awake and alert. The baby was making soft, happy sounds, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. But there was something different about her vocalizations now, a pattern to them that almost sounded like language, though no language any human would recognize. The animals seemed to understand, though, their heads tilting, ears swiveling, all attention focused on the infant who had somehow become the center of this impossible gathering. Lily began setting up her equipment with silent efficiency, her movements careful not to disturb the scene. She started with the camera, using a night vision setting to capture the arrangement of animals, the way they had organized themselves with such deliberate purpose. Ethan continued documenting in his notebook, sketching the scene, noting the species present. The way the early morning mist created an ethereal atmosphere that made everything seem like a dream. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, illuminating the clearing in stages, something extraordinary happened. The bear stood up, still cradling the baby, and began to move. It wasn't the shuffling gait typical of bears, but something more deliberate, almost ceremonial. She walked the perimeter of the circle, pausing before different animals, the baby reaching out with tiny hands toward each one. And as she passed, the animals responded, some with sounds, some with gestures, all with a focused attention that suggested meaning beyond simple instinct. When the bear completed the circle, she returned to the center and did something that made both Ethan and Lily gasp. She held the baby up, lifting her toward the brightening sky, and made a sound unlike anything either of them had ever heard. A deep, resonant call that seemed to come from the earth itself. The baby laughed, that pure, delighted sound that had punctuated so many of the healing sessions, and every animal in the clearing responded with their own vocalizations, creating a chorus that should have been cacophonous but was somehow harmonious. The moment stretched, seeming to exist outside of time, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The bear lowered the baby back to her protective embrace, the animals fell silent, and the clearing returned to its peaceful stillness. But something had changed. Ethan could feel it, like the air pressure had shifted, like the world had been subtly reorganized in some fundamental way. Lily was crying, tears streaming down her face as she continued to operate the camera, determined to capture every second, even as she was overwhelmed by the emotion of what she was witnessing. Ethan found himself thinking about all the ancient stories of humans and animals living in harmony, of a time before the separation between wild and civilized, and wondering if they had just witnessed an echo of that lost connection. As the morning progressed, the animals began to disperse again, but more slowly than before, as if reluctant to leave. Some approached the bear one last time, and she acknowledged each one with that steady, knowing gaze. The baby had fallen asleep again, apparently exhausted by whatever role she had played in the morning's ceremony. And gradually the clearing emptied until only the core group remained: the bear, the baby, and a handful of the most devoted attendants. It was then that they heard it, voices in the distance calling out, search parties getting closer. Ethan and Lily exchanged worried glances, knowing their time was running out. They quickly packed up the equipment, gathering all the evidence they had managed to collect. But even as they prepared for the inevitable, they saw the bear's head turn toward the sound of approaching humans, her posture changing in a way that suggested she, too, knew what was coming. What happened next would be burned into Ethan's memory forever. The bear gently picked up the baby, holding her with a care that seemed impossible for such powerful limbs. She looked directly at Ethan and Lily, those ancient eyes conveying something that transcended species, transcended language. It was gratitude, perhaps, or maybe understanding, or possibly a request, to remember, to honor what they had witnessed, to protect what could be protected. Then the bear began to walk, not away from the approaching voices, but toward them, carrying the baby with deliberate purpose. Ethan and Lily followed at a distance, watching as the bear navigated through the trees with the baby held securely against her chest. The voices grew louder, more urgent, and then there were shouts of alarm as the search party spotted the impossible sight of a bear carrying a human infant. Ethan ran forward, calling out to the searchers, identifying himself as a ranger, telling them not to shoot, that the situation was under control. The scene that followed was chaos, people shouting, radios crackling, weapons being drawn despite Ethan's protests. But through it all, the bear remained calm, walking steadily forward until she was just at the edge of the trees, visible to all but still within the forest's embrace. The search party had formed a semicircle at the forest's edge, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fear as they watched the massive bear emerge from the trees with baby Emma cradled against her chest. Jessica Brooks, the lead coordinator of the search effort, stood frozen with her radio halfway to her mouth, her training completely inadequate for the scene unfolding before her. The bear moved with such deliberate care, each step measured and purposeful, that even the most trigger-happy member of the team hesitated to act. Ethan pushed his way through the crowd, his ranger uniform giving him the authority he needed to take control of the situation, though his voice shook as he ordered everyone to lower their weapons and stay calm. The bear stopped just at the tree line, as if understanding that crossing into the open field would escalate the situation beyond recovery. She stood there, magnificent and terrifying in the morning light, the baby held securely but gently in her massive arms. Emma was awake now, her small hands patting the bear's fur with the casual familiarity of a child with a beloved pet, completely unaware of the drama her presence was causing. The contrast between the infant's contentment and the adult's panic would have been comical if the situation weren't so potentially dangerous. Lily had caught up now, her scientific mind racing as she observed the crowd's reaction, already thinking about how this moment would be remembered, recorded, and likely misunderstood. She moved to stand beside Ethan, adding her voice to his, explaining in calm, measured tones that the bear was not a threat, that something extraordinary had been happening in the forest that defied conventional understanding. But her words seemed to bounce off the wall of fear and disbelief that surrounded the search party like armor. Then, from the back of the crowd, came a sound that changed everything, a mother's anguished cry. Sarah Marshall, Emma's mother, pushed through the searchers, her face streaked with tears, her body trembling with the exhaustion of a night spent in terror. Her husband, David, was right behind her, his hand on her shoulder, trying to hold her back even as his own eyes locked on their daughter. The bear's head turned toward the sound, those intelligent eyes taking in the approaching parents with what Ethan could only describe as recognition. Sarah stopped just a few feet from the bear, close enough that everyone gasped, weapons raising again despite Ethan's continued protests. But something in the bear's posture, perhaps, or maybe some primal maternal communication that transcended species, made Sarah pause. The two mothers, one human, one Ursine, regarded each other across a gap that was both mere feet and millions of years of evolution. The baby, sensing her mother's presence, turned her head and reached out with both arms, making the happy gurgling sound that parents know means recognition and joy. The bear did something then that made several members of the search party later swear they must have been hallucinating. She took a step forward, closing the distance between herself and Sarah, and carefully, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature of her size and power, transferred the baby from her arms to her mother's. The exchange was smooth, deliberate, and filled with such obvious care that even the most skeptical observer couldn't deny the intelligence behind it. Sarah clutched Emma to her chest, sobbing with relief, while David wrapped his arms around both of them, his own tears falling freely. But the bear didn't immediately retreat. Instead, she sat back on her haunches, watching the reunion with those knowing eyes, as if ensuring that the baby was truly safe, truly where she belonged. Emma, for her part, seemed confused by the sudden change, turning in her mother's arms to look back at the bear, reaching out one small hand as if to say goodbye. The bear leaned forward slightly, just enough for the baby's fingers to brush her nose one last time, and then she stood and began to walk backward, never turning away, maintaining eye contact with the humans until she disappeared into the shadows of the forest. The clearing erupted in chaos the moment the bear was gone. Radios crackled with reports, people shouted questions, and Sarah and David were surrounded by paramedics wanting to examine Emma for injuries or signs of trauma. But the baby was perfect, clean, well-fed, showing no signs of distress or harm. If anything, she seemed calmer than any 6-month-old had a right to be after spending a night in the forest. The only evidence of her unusual experience was a faint scent of pine and earth in her hair, and a few strands of brown fur caught in her tiny fingers. Ethan and Lily stood apart from the commotion, both understanding that what they had witnessed was already being transformed into something else, something that fit more comfortably into the human understanding of the world. The official report would likely mention a bear that had found the baby, and, through some quirk of nature, had chosen to protect rather than harm her. There might be speculation about maternal instincts triggered by the infant's cries, or theories about bears' occasionally documented protective behavior toward human young. But the truth, the healing circle, the gathering of traumatized animals, the mysterious communion between species that would remain known only to them. As the search party began to disperse, Ethan heard fragments of conversation that confirmed his fears. People were already talking about organizing a hunt, about the danger of a bear that had gotten too comfortable with humans, about the need to protect the community from future incidents. He tried to intervene, to explain that the bear was not a threat, but his words were dismissed as the ramblings of someone who had been too long in the woods, too close to nature to maintain proper perspective. Even Jessica Brooks, who had always respected his expertise, looked at him with concern rather than belief when he tried to describe what he and Lily had actually observed. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity that Ethan and Lily could only watch from the periphery. The story of the baby and the bear made national news, though each retelling seemed to stray further from the truth. Television crews descended on the small mountain town, interviewing anyone who claimed to have knowledge of the incident. Experts were brought in to explain bear behavior, to reassure the public that such events were extremely rare, to debate whether the bear should be tracked and relocated or worse. Through it all, Emma's parents remained largely silent, granting only one interview in which they expressed their gratitude for their daughter's safe return and asked for privacy to process their experience. Ethan returned to the clearing every day, sometimes alone, sometimes with Lily, but it was never the same. The bear was gone, and with her, the strange peace that had made the space sacred. The animals still came. He would occasionally spot a fox or a rabbit that he recognized from the gatherings, but they no longer lingered, no longer seemed to find the healing they had once sought. The clearing had returned to being just another small opening in the vast forest, beautiful but ordinary, holding its secrets close. On the fourth day after Emma's return, Ethan found something that made his heart race. Near the base of the pine tree where the baby had been discovered, partially buried under freshly fallen needles, was a small object. It was a river stone, smooth and round, with natural markings that looked almost like a bear's paw print. But what made it extraordinary was that it had been deliberately placed, positioned with care rather than randomly deposited. Beside it were other small objects, a perfect owl feather, a tuft of fox fur, an acorn with unusual coloring. It was as if the animals had left offerings, tokens of their experience in this place of healing. Lily documented everything with her characteristic thoroughness, photographing each object, measuring their placement, taking samples for analysis that she knew would reveal nothing unusual in their physical composition. But both she and Ethan understood that these items were evidence of something beyond the physical, proof that what they had witnessed had been real and meaningful to more than just themselves. They carefully collected the offerings, storing them in a special box that Lily kept locked in her research station, away from curious eyes and skeptical colleagues. Meanwhile, the official investigation continued, focused on finding and dealing with the bear. Teams of trackers with dogs combed the forest, following trails that seemed to lead nowhere, finding signs that contradicted each other. The bear had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving only confused footprints and the fading scent of her presence. Some of the trackers reported strange experiences, their usually reliable dogs refusing to follow certain paths, equipment malfunctioning in specific areas, an odd feeling of being watched even when no animals were visible. But these reports were dismissed as irrelevant to the main objective. Ethan tried one more time to influence the situation, meeting with his supervisor and presenting a carefully edited version of his observations. He emphasized the bear's non-aggressive behavior, her apparent intelligence, the way she had deliberately returned the baby to her parents. He argued for calling off the hunt, for designating the area as a protected zone for research, for considering that perhaps they had encountered something worthy of study rather than elimination. His supervisor listened patiently, then explained that public safety had to come first, that a bear comfortable enough with humans to take a baby, regardless of the outcome, was too dangerous to leave free. That night, Ethan sat in his cabin, staring at his notebooks full of observations, wondering what to do with the knowledge he carried. He thought about writing it all down, creating a complete record of what he had witnessed, but who would believe him? And more importantly, what good would it do? The magic of the clearing had already been broken by human intrusion. Perhaps some secrets were meant to remain hidden, some miracles were meant to be witnessed by only a few. He made the decision to keep his complete observations private, sharing them only with Lily, trusting that someday, when the world was ready, the truth might emerge. Lily, for her part, was struggling with her own ethical dilemma. As a scientist, she felt obligated to share her discoveries with the academic community. The implications of what they had witnessed were staggering, evidence of interspecies empathy and communication that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness and intelligence in non-human animals. But she also understood that publishing their findings would bring the wrong kind of attention, would turn the forest into a circus of researchers and tourists, would destroy any chance of the healing circle ever reforming. They met one evening at the research station, spreading their combined documentation across Lily's desk. Notebooks, photographs, videos, audio recordings, and the small collection of offerings from the clearing. Together, they made the difficult decision to create a complete archive of their experience, but to seal it away, to be opened only when they both agreed the time was right. They spent hours organizing everything, cross-referencing their observations, creating a comprehensive record that future researchers might someday use to understand what they had witnessed. As they worked, Lily shared a theory she had been developing. She wondered if what they had seen was not unique, but simply rarely observed. If perhaps all over the world, in places where humans rarely ventured, animals had developed complex social structures and behaviors that we couldn't imagine. The bear's healing circle might be just one example of a vast hidden world of animal consciousness and cooperation that existed parallel to but separate from human civilization. It was a romantic notion, perhaps, but after what they had witnessed, neither of them was willing to dismiss any possibility. The search for the bear continued for 2 more weeks, gradually expanding to cover hundreds of square miles of forest. But it was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving no trail that even the most experienced trackers could follow. Some suggested she had moved to a different territory, frightened by the human activity. Others wondered if she had died, though no body was ever found. A few of the searchers, those who had spent the most time in the deep woods, whispered about strange experiences, feelings of being guided away from certain areas, paths that seemed to shift when they weren't looking, the sensation of ancient eyes watching from the shadows. Emma, meanwhile, was thriving. Her parents reported that she was calmer than before her adventure, sleeping better, crying less. She would sometimes make unusual sounds, vocalizations that didn't quite match typical baby babble, as if she were trying to communicate in a language she had learned during her time in the forest. When they took her to the pediatrician for a follow-up exam, the doctor found nothing wrong, commenting only that Emma seemed remarkably healthy and well-adjusted for a child who had experienced such an ordeal. 1 month after the incident, Ethan was conducting a routine patrol in a section of forest miles from the clearing when he felt it, that familiar sensation of being watched by something ancient and intelligent. He stopped, his heart racing, and slowly turned in a circle, scanning the trees. There, barely visible in the dappled sunlight, stood the bear. She was watching him from a distance, her posture relaxed but alert. They regarded each other for a long moment, and Ethan understood that she was showing him she had survived, that she continued her work somewhere else, somewhere safer from human intrusion. He wanted to approach her, to somehow communicate his regret for how things had ended, his wish that the healing circle could have continued. But he knew better than to move toward her. Instead, he simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect, and the bear did something that would stay with him forever. She stood up on her hind legs, raised one paw in what looked unmistakably like a wave, and then dropped back to all fours and melted into the forest. Ethan never saw her again, though he sometimes felt her presence during his patrols, a benevolent guardian watching over her domain. Lily continued her official research, publishing papers on conventional animal behavior that earned her recognition in her field. But she also pursued a private line of inquiry, carefully documenting unusual animal behaviors reported from around the world, looking for patterns that might suggest other healing circles, other examples of the impossible communion they had witnessed. She corresponded with indigenous peoples who had stories of animal healers, with forest rangers who reported strange gatherings, with anyone who might have glimpsed the hidden world she now knew existed. 3 months after Emma's return, Lily made a discovery that sent chills down her spine. In the research station's old archives, she found a journal from a ranger who had worked the same forest in the 1950s. His entries described a clearing where animals gathered in unusual harmony, where a large bear seemed to preside over some sort of natural ceremony. The descriptions were less detailed than their own observations, the ranger clearly struggling to understand what he was seeing, but the similarities were unmistakable. The healing circle, it seemed, was not new. It had existed for at least decades, perhaps centuries, hidden in the deep forest, revealed only to those who stumbled upon it by chance or destiny. She shared the journal with Ethan, and together they pieced together a history that had been hiding in plain sight. Other records, when examined with their new understanding, revealed similar stories. Indigenous legends of bear healers, settler accounts of impossible animal gatherings, modern reports dismissed as hallucinations or misidentifications. The bear they had met was perhaps not the first of her kind, but part of a lineage, a tradition passed down through generations of animals in ways humans couldn't fathom. This realization changed everything for both of them. They weren't just witnesses to a singular miraculous event, but to a glimpse of an ancient, ongoing relationship between species that existed beyond human understanding. The forest was not just trees and animals, but a complex community with its own wisdom, its own methods of healing and communication. The bear had not been an anomaly, but a practitioner of something older and deeper than human civilization. As autumn turned to winter, the story of Emma and the bear faded from public attention, replaced by new dramas and disasters. The search was officially called off, the bear classified as relocated naturally in the official reports. The clearing remained unmarked on maps, protected only by its ordinariness and the fact that Ethan quietly redirected trails away from it whenever he had the chance. Life returned to normal, or at least to what passed for normal when carrying the weight of impossible knowledge. But for those who had been touched by the experience, nothing was quite the same. Sarah and David noticed that Emma had an unusual affinity for animals, that even as she grew older, creatures seemed drawn to her in ways that defied explanation. Birds would land near her without fear, dogs would calm in her presence, and once, during a camping trip when she was 2 years old, a deer walked right up to her and allowed her to pet its nose. They never spoke publicly about these incidents, but privately they wondered what their daughter had experienced during her night in the forest. What connection had been forged that continued to manifest in small miracles? Ethan found his relationship with the forest fundamentally changed. Every patrol became a meditation on the mysteries that surrounded him, every animal citing a potential glimpse into that hidden world of consciousness and communication. He became known among his colleagues as someone with an almost supernatural ability to find and help injured animals, though he never explained that he was simply more open to seeing the signs they left, more willing to follow the subtle guidance of the forest itself. He also became the unofficial guardian of stories, collecting accounts from other rangers, from hikers, from anyone who had experienced something in the woods that didn't quite fit the normal pattern. Most were easily explained, but occasionally someone would describe something, a gathering of different species, a moment of impossible interspecies cooperation, a feeling of ancient intelligence watching from the trees, that made him know the healing circles continued, hidden and protected by their own mysterious means. Lily published her conventional research, but also began writing something else, a book that was part science, part philosophy, part mystery. She called it The Hidden Forest, and in it she explored the possibility that consciousness and intelligence in nature existed on a spectrum far broader than humans had ever imagined. She never mentioned the healing circle directly, never provided evidence that could lead others to search for it, but she planted seeds of wonder, encouraging readers to look at the natural world with new eyes, to be open to possibilities beyond current understanding. The book was moderately successful, praised by some for its innovative thinking and dismissed by others as too speculative. But it found its audience among those who had always suspected there was more to nature than what science had so far revealed, those who had their own stories of impossible animal encounters. those who felt the presence of intelligence in the wild places of the world. Through careful words and selective examples, Lily created a framework for understanding experiences like the healing circle without ever revealing its existence. 1 year after Emma's night in the forest, Ethan returned to the clearing on the anniversary, not really expecting anything but feeling the need to mark the occasion. The space was quiet, ordinary, giving no hint of the miraculous events that had taken place there. He sat on a fallen log, pulling out the original notebook where he had first documented his observations, reading through his own amazed words, remembering the awe and wonder of those first moments. As the sun began to set, painting the clearing in golden light reminiscent of that magical morning, he heard a rustling in the underbrush. A fox emerged, one he recognized by the distinctive white tip on its tail. One of the regular attendees of the healing circle. The fox regarded him for a moment, then did something extraordinary. It approached him directly, without fear, and placed something at his feet before retreating to a safe distance. Ethan looked down to find a small bundle of leaves wrapped around what appeared to be berries, arranged with deliberate care. More rustling followed, and other animals appeared. A rabbit, a raccoon, even the crow with the once injured wing. Each one brought something, a shiny stone, a perfect feather, an unusual seed, placing their offerings near him before withdrawing. They formed a loose circle around the clearing, not the organized gathering of the healing circle, but something more like a remembrance, an acknowledgement of shared experience. Ethan sat perfectly still, understanding that he was being honored, included in something sacred. As darkness fell and the animals gradually melted back into the forest, Ethan carefully gathered the offerings, adding them to the collection he and Lily maintained. He understood the message. The healing might have moved elsewhere, the bear might be gone, but the connection forged in this place persisted. The animals remembered, just as he did, and in their own way, they were keeping the story alive, passing it down through whatever mysterious means they used to communicate across species and generations. Walking back through the dark forest, guided more by instinct than sight, Ethan thought about the future. Someday, perhaps, the world would be ready to accept what he and Lily had witnessed. Someday, the barriers between human and animal consciousness might be understood as more permeable than currently believed. Someday, the healing circles might not need to hide, might be able to exist openly as places of wonder and restoration for all creatures. But until then, he would keep the secret, protect the mystery, and continue to walk the forest with eyes open to miracles. The story of Emma and the bear became local legend, told and retold with various embellishments and interpretations. Some versions had the bear speaking human words, others had Emma possessed of magical powers that commanded animal obedience. The truth, as is often the case, was both simpler and more profound than any of the stories. It was about connection, about the possibility of empathy and understanding across the vast divide of species, about the healing power of innocence and the wisdom of wildness. Lily and Ethan continued their work, their lives forever changed by those few days of witness to the impossible. They met regularly to compare notes, to share new discoveries, to reassure each other that what they had seen was real when doubt crept in. Their archive grew, carefully maintained and hidden, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. They both understood that they had been given a gift, not just the experience itself, but the responsibility of holding it until the world was ready to receive it. 5 years passed, and Emma grew into a remarkable child, bright, empathetic, with an unusual ability to calm those around her. Her parents noticed that she would sometimes stand at the edge of the forest, looking into the trees as if searching for something or someone. When asked what she was looking for, she would say she didn't know, just that sometimes she felt like the forest was calling her. They never discouraged these moments, understanding on some level that their daughter's connection to the wild was part of who she was, part of what had brought her back to them. On her 6th birthday, Emma's parents decided to tell her the story of her night in the forest. They kept it simple, age-appropriate, but they told her about the bear who had protected her, about the ranger who had helped bring her home, about the mystery that still surrounded that night. Emma listened with intense concentration, and when they finished, she smiled and said something that made their hearts skip. "I remember the bear. She was sad, but kind. She was helping the hurt animals feel better, and I was helping too." Her parents exchanged glances, unsure whether this was real memory or childhood imagination influenced by their story. But Emma continued, describing things they hadn't told her. The way the clearing smelled of pine and earth. The sound the bear made that was like a lullaby, the feeling of fur against her cheek. Whether these were true memories or something else, they couldn't say, but they knew their daughter carried something special from that night, something that would be part of her always. Ethan heard about Emma's memories through the small-town grapevine and felt a mixture of excitement and concern. If Emma truly remembered the healing circle, she might be the key to understanding what had really happened, but she was also just a child, and he worried about the burden of such knowledge. He reached out to her parents, offering to share what he knew when they felt Emma was ready, but also counseling patience. Some mysteries, he had learned, revealed themselves in their own time. As more years passed, Ethan noticed subtle changes in the forest. Areas that had been degraded by human activity began to recover more quickly than expected. Animal populations that had been declining stabilized and even grew. There were reports of unusual cooperation between species during natural disasters, predators and prey sheltering together during severe storms, different species working together to access food sources. It was as if the lesson of the healing circle was spreading, as if the forest itself was learning and adapting. Lily's research led her to similar phenomena in other parts of the world. She corresponded with researchers in Africa who had observed elephants appearing to comfort other species in distress, with marine biologists who documented dolphins protecting humans and other animals from sharks, with observers everywhere who had witnessed moments of inexplicable interspecies empathy. The healing circle, she began to believe, was not unique but part of a global awakening, a shift in consciousness that was happening whether humans recognized it or not. 10 years after that magical morning in the clearing, Ethan was nearing retirement. His hair had gone gray, his step had slowed, but his connection to the forest had only deepened. He had trained younger rangers, carefully selecting those who showed openness to mystery, gradually sharing hints of the deeper truths he had discovered. Some dismissed his stories as the romanticization of an old woodsman, but others listened, and a few even reported their own encounters with the inexplicable. On his last official day as a ranger, Ethan made one final visit to the clearing. It looked much the same as it had that first morning, perhaps a little more overgrown, the ancient pine still standing sentinel. He sat in the same spot where he had first observed the healing circle, pulling out his original notebook, now worn and weather-stained. As he read his own words from a decade ago, he marveled at how much had changed and how much had remained the same. The forest was quiet around him, but it was a comfortable quiet, a familiar silence that felt like an old friend. He thought about all the secrets these trees held, all the mysteries that played out beyond human observation. He thought about the bear, wondering if she still lived, if she had passed her knowledge to others, if somewhere in the vast wilderness, healing circles still formed. He thought about Emma, now a teenager, who had grown into a remarkable young woman with a gift for understanding and comforting others. As the sun began to set, Ethan stood to leave, taking one last look around the clearing. And then he saw it, carved into the bark of the ancient pine. So faint he might have missed it if the light hadn't been just right. Was a small symbol. It looked like a paw print, but within it were other marks. Tiny scratches that could have been random but seemed deliberate. He moved closer, studying the carving, and realized with a start that it resembled the pattern of animals he had sketched that first morning, their positions around the healing circle captured in abstract form. He ran his fingers over the marks, wondering who or what had made them. Had another human witnessed the healing circle and left this record? Or was it possible that somehow, in some way he couldn't fathom, the animals themselves had created this memorial? The thought should have seemed absurd, but after everything he had seen, Ethan was no longer willing to dismiss any possibility. He took a photo of the carving, adding it to his archive, one more piece of evidence that miracles had happened here. Lily received the photo that evening and spent hours analyzing it, comparing it to Ethan's original sketches, looking for patterns and meaning. She found correlations that seemed too precise to be coincidental, arrangements that suggested not just recording, but understanding, as if whoever or whatever had made the carving had grasped the significance of what had occurred. It was, she realized, a form of communication, a message left for those who knew how to read it. Together, they decided it was time to begin sharing their story more widely, though still carefully. They started with Emma, now 16 and mature enough to understand the full implications of what had happened during her infancy. They met with her and her parents, sharing their complete documentation, showing them the videos and photos, explaining their theories about consciousness and communication in nature. Emma listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, her eyes bright with recognition rather than surprise. When they finished, Emma was quiet for a long moment, then said something that confirmed what they had long suspected. She told them that she had always felt different, connected to something larger than herself. She described dreams where she could understand what animals were feeling, moments in her daily life when she seemed to know what a creature needed without any logical reason. She had thought she was imagining things, but now she understood that her night in the forest had left her with a gift, or perhaps had awakened something that had always been there. Emma became part of their small circle of knowledge, helping to document new instances of unusual animal behavior, using her unique sensitivity to recognize genuine moments of interspecies communication. She was particularly good at finding what she called thin places, locations where the boundary between human and animal consciousness seemed more permeable. Some of these places showed signs of being former or current healing circles, though none as developed as the one they had witnessed. As Emma prepared to leave for college, planning to study both biology and psychology to better understand the connection between consciousness and communication, she made a request. She wanted to spend one night in the forest, in the clearing where her journey had begun. Her parents were reluctant, but Ethan and Lily supported her, understanding that this was something she needed to do. They agreed to stay nearby, close enough to help if needed, but far enough to allow her the solitude she sought. That night, as Emma sat in the clearing under a canopy of stars, she felt rather than heard movement around her. Animals emerged from the forest. Not the great gathering of the healing circle, but a small group of creatures that seemed to have been waiting for her return. A fox, a rabbit, an owl, even a young bear that might have been a descendant of her protector. They didn't approach her directly, but arranged themselves around the clearing, creating a loose circle with her at the center. Emma understood without words what was being asked of her. She was being invited to continue what had been started here, to be a bridge between worlds, to help maintain the ancient connections that modern life had nearly severed. She didn't know if she was ready for such responsibility, but she knew she had to try. She began to hum, a wordless melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep within, a sound she remembered without remembering from that night so long ago. The animals responded, each adding their own voice to create a chorus that was both strange and beautiful. It wasn't the healing circle that required something she didn't possess, perhaps couldn't possess as a human, but it was a communion, a moment of connection that transcended species and spoke to something fundamental about consciousness and existence. As the night wore on, Emma felt herself changing, not physically but in some deeper way, accepting a role she was only beginning to understand. When morning came and the animals dispersed, Emma emerged from the forest different than when she had entered. She carried with her a certainty about her path forward, an understanding that her experience as an infant had not been random but part of something larger. She would study, she would learn, she would document, but most importantly, she would serve as a translator between worlds, helping humanity understand that consciousness and compassion were not uniquely human traits, but threads in a tapestry that connected all living things. Ethan officially retired, but continued his work as a consultant, advising on conservation efforts that took into account the deeper connections he had observed. He wrote his memoirs, carefully crafted to share truths without revealing specific locations or details that could lead to exploitation. His book, Listening to the Forest, became a quiet bestseller among those who sensed there was more to nature than what appeared on the surface. Lily expanded her research, finally publishing papers that pushed the boundaries of accepted animal behavior science. She faced criticism and skepticism, but also found allies among researchers who had observed similar phenomena but lacked the courage to report it. Gradually, a new field began to emerge, the study of interspecies consciousness and communication, though it remained on the fringe of mainstream science. The clearing itself remained protected by its ordinariness and the subtle redirecting of trails that Ethan had established and his successors maintained. Occasionally, a hiker would stumble upon it and feel something unusual, a peace that went beyond the normal tranquility of the forest. Some would sit for a while, unconsciously absorbing whatever remained of the healing energy. Others would take photos, trying to capture something they felt but couldn't define. But none witnessed what Ethan and Lily had seen, as if that level of magic required specific circumstances that might not align again for generations. 20 years after the original events, Emma returned to the forest as Dr. Emma Marshall, a respected researcher in the new field of interspecies consciousness studies. She had spent years documenting cases around the world, building a body of evidence that even skeptics found hard to dismiss entirely. Her work had taken her to rainforests where apes seemed to conduct rituals for their dead, to oceans where whales sang songs that appeared to contain information passed down through generations, to mountains where birds and mammals cooperated in ways that defied traditional understanding of instinct. She established a research station near the forest where her story had begun, a place where scientists could study the subtle connections between species without disrupting them. The station became a gathering place for those who believed that consciousness was not a human monopoly, but a spectrum that included all living things in various degrees. Under her guidance, researchers developed new methods for observing and documenting animal behavior that went beyond traditional ethology, incorporating insights from psychology, philosophy, and even quantum physics. One of Emma's most significant discoveries came when she found evidence of what she called consciousness networks. areas where multiple species seemed to share information in ways that couldn't be explained by conventional communication methods. These networks often centered around specific locations, usually places of natural beauty or ecological significance. The clearing, where she had spent that fateful night as an infant, was one such place, though she was careful never to reveal its exact location in her published work. Ethan, now in his 80s, served as an advisor to Emma's research station, sharing his decades of observations and insights. He had become something of a legend among those who studied interspecies consciousness, the ranger who had witnessed the impossible and had the courage to document it. Young researchers would seek him out, eager to hear his stories, to learn from someone who had seen behind the veil that separated human understanding from the deeper mysteries of nature. During one of his visits to the station, Ethan shared a theory he had been developing. He believed that the healing circles and consciousness networks were not new phenomena, but had always existed, hidden from human observation by our own limited perception and disbelief. As humanity had become more separated from nature, these connections had become harder to see, existing only in places and moments where the conditions were exactly right, but they had never disappeared, waiting patiently for humans to evolve enough in their understanding to recognize them. Lily, still active in her 70s, had compiled their original archive into a comprehensive digital database, adding to it all the evidence that had been collected over the years. She worked with Emma to create protocols for protecting sites of interspecies consciousness activity while still allowing for careful study. They understood the delicate balance required. Too much human attention would destroy what they sought to understand, but complete secrecy would prevent the paradigm shift in consciousness that they believed was necessary for humanity's future. Together, the three of them, the ranger, the scientist, and the bridge between worlds, had created a foundation for understanding that would outlive them all. They had taken an impossible moment, a miraculous encounter between a bear and a baby, and transformed it into the beginning of a new way of seeing the world. Their work inspired others to look more closely at the natural world, to question assumptions about consciousness and intelligence, to remain open to wonders that science had not yet learned to measure. As Emma stood in the clearing on another anniversary of that first encounter, now middle-aged herself, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The bear was long gone, having lived out her natural lifespan, but her legacy lived on in the stories, in the research, in the gradually shifting human consciousness that was beginning to recognize the intelligence and emotion in other species. Emma's own children, raised with an understanding of these connections, showed even stronger abilities to communicate across species boundaries, suggesting that evolution itself might be pushing humanity toward a greater integration with the natural world. The clearing had become, in its own quiet way, a shrine to possibility. No markers identified it, no trails led directly to it, but those who needed to find it somehow did. Scientists, seekers, and sometimes just people in need of healing would stumble upon it, would sit in the dappled sunlight, and would feel something shift inside them. Some reported seeing animals that shouldn't be there, experiencing moments of communication that couldn't quite be explained. Others simply found peace, a respite from the chaos of modern life, a reminder that there were still mysteries in the world. Emma had learned to recognize the signs that a new healing circle was forming somewhere in the world. There would be reports of unusual animal gatherings, of predators and prey coexisting peacefully, of injured or traumatized creatures finding their way to specific locations. She would dispatch discreet observers, researchers trained in her methods of non-invasive documentation, to record what they could without disturbing the delicate balance. Each new discovery added to the growing body of evidence that consciousness in nature was far more complex and interconnected than humanity had ever imagined. The technology had evolved, too. Where Ethan had relied on notebooks and sketches, modern researchers used devices that could detect subtle electromagnetic fields, record sounds beyond human hearing, and capture images in spectrums invisible to the naked eye. These tools revealed layers of communication and connection that had always existed but had been beyond human perception. Birds, it turned out, could see magnetic fields that helped them navigate, but also seemed to serve social functions. Trees communicated through chemical signals that warned of dangers, but also shared resources with those in need. One of the most remarkable discoveries came when researchers found that the locations of healing circles and consciousness networks often corresponded with places that indigenous peoples had long considered sacred. The knowledge that modern science was slowly uncovering had been preserved in stories and traditions for thousands of years, hidden in plain sight in myths about talking animals and healing forests. Emma worked with indigenous elders, learning from their perspectives, understanding that science was not discovering something new, but rediscovering something that had been known and then forgotten. As climate change and habitat destruction accelerated, the importance of understanding these connections became critical. Emma's research showed that ecosystems with strong consciousness networks were more resilient, better able to adapt to changes and recover from damage. The implications were staggering. Protecting these networks might be key to preserving biodiversity and maintaining the ecological balance necessary for life on Earth. What had started as a mystery in a forest clearing had become relevant to the survival of the planet itself. Governments and conservation organizations began to take notice, though many remained skeptical. Emma and her team worked to translate their findings into language that policymakers could understand and act upon. They developed new models for conservation that took into account not just species and habitats, but the invisible networks of consciousness that connected them. Some countries began to establish consciousness preserves, areas protected not just for their biological diversity, but for their role in maintaining these mysterious but vital connections. The children who had grown up hearing the story of Emma and the bear became adults who saw the world differently. They entered fields like biology, psychology, and environmental science with an understanding that consciousness was not confined to humans, that intelligence took many forms, that the natural world was not just a resource but a community of which humanity was just one part. This shift in perspective, slow but steady, began to influence everything from agricultural practices to urban planning, from education curricula to legal frameworks for animal rights. Ethan lived to see the beginning of this transformation, passing away peacefully at 92, his last words reportedly about hearing the bear calling him home. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his story, by his courage in documenting the impossible. The clearing where it all began was never officially designated as his memorial, but those who knew the story would leave small offerings there, a flower, a stone, a written memory, creating a new kind of healing circle, one that honored the connection between all who had been part of this journey. Lily continued her work into her 90s, her mind sharp even as her body grew frail. She became the keeper of stories, collecting accounts from around the world of moments when the veil between species grew thin. Her final book, The Grammar of Consciousness, attempted to create a framework for understanding how different species might experience awareness, emotion, and communication. It was dense, challenging reading, but it became foundational text for those studying interspecies consciousness, a bridge between hard science and the ineffable mysteries that science struggled to quantify. Emma, now the global authority on consciousness networks, established institutes on every continent, each one dedicated to studying and protecting local manifestations of interspecies connection. She trained a new generation of researchers who combined scientific rigor with openness to wonder, who understood that some truths could only be approached obliquely, with patience and humility. Her own children, showing remarkable abilities to facilitate interspecies communication, suggested that humanity might be evolving, developing new capacities in response to the challenges of living on a crowded, threatened planet. The clearing itself underwent a subtle transformation over the years. The ancient pine that had stood sentinel finally fell during a storm, but from its decaying trunk grew new life. Mushrooms that formed unusual patterns, mosses that seemed to glow in certain lights, wildflowers that bloomed out of season. Animals still gathered there, though never again in the organized healing circles of that original encounter. Instead, it became a place of pilgrimage for creatures seeking something they couldn't name, a peace that went beyond the absence of conflict. Researchers studying the soil and air in the clearing found anomalies they couldn't explain, mineral compositions that shouldn't exist, atmospheric conditions that defied local weather patterns, electromagnetic readings that suggested some kind of ongoing energy exchange. Some theorized that the intense emotional and consciousness activity that had occurred there had somehow altered the physical space, creating a permanent thin spot between dimensions of awareness. Others suggested more prosaic explanations, but none quite fit all the data. As the story of Emma and the bear passed into legend, details were lost and added, transformed by each telling. Some versions had the bear speaking prophecies. Others had Emma growing up with the ability to transform into animals. The truth, as those who had been there knew, was both simpler and more profound. It was about connection, about the possibility of understanding across difference, about the healing that comes from recognizing consciousness wherever it exists. But perhaps the myths served their purpose too, keeping alive the wonder, the possibility, the hope that humans and nature could find their way back to harmony. 50 years after that morning in the clearing, Emma's granddaughter, Sarah, stood in the same spot where her grandmother had been found as an infant. Sarah had grown up with the story, had inherited not just the tale but some of the sensitivity to interspecies consciousness that seemed to run in the family. She was there to conduct a ceremony, a gathering of researchers and indigenous elders, scientists and storytellers, to honor the anniversary and to formally establish the forest as a protected consciousness preserve. As the ceremony began, with songs and prayers from various traditions, something unexpected happened. Animals began to emerge from the forest. Not just a few, but dozens, then hundreds. Bears and deer, foxes and rabbits, birds of every description. Even insects formed unusual patterns in the air. They didn't approach the humans directly, but created a vast circle around them. Each species maintaining its comfortable distance while clearly participating in something larger. Sarah felt it then, what her grandmother must have felt all those years ago, the presence of an intelligence that transcended individual consciousness, a network of awareness that included every living thing in the forest and perhaps beyond. It wasn't the organized healing circle of the original encounter, but something new, something that suggested the next phase of evolution in the relationship between humanity and nature. The animals weren't coming to be healed this time. They were coming to teach, to share, to invite humanity into a deeper participation in the community of consciousness. The ceremony continued for hours. Humans and animals sharing space in a way that should have been impossible, that defied every rule of wildlife behavior. Cameras recorded it all, though everyone present knew that no amount of documentation could capture the feeling of being part of something so profound. As the sun set and the animals gradually returned to the forest, Sarah understood that her grandmother's story had not ended, but had only been the beginning of a larger tale that would take generations to fully unfold. In the years that followed, similar gatherings occurred around the world, always spontaneously, always in places where consciousness networks were strong. Scientists studied them, mystics interpreted them, skeptics dismissed them, but they continued happening, suggesting that something fundamental was shifting in the relationship between humanity and the rest of the living world. The healing circles had evolved into something else, teaching circles perhaps, or consciousness conventions, where the boundaries between species became permeable, and communication happened on levels that human language couldn't quite capture. Emma, now in her 80s, watched these developments with satisfaction and wonder. The baby, who had been found in a forest, protected by a bear, had become the catalyst for a transformation in human understanding that was still unfolding. She had spent her life trying to understand what had happened to her, and in doing so, had helped humanity begin to understand itself as part of a larger consciousness that included all life. It was, she reflected, a good life's work, though she knew it was far from complete. As she sat in her study, surrounded by decades of research, Emma often thought about the bear, not just as a memory but as a presence that had shaped everything that came after. She wondered if the bear had known, in some way, what would unfold from that morning's encounter. Had she chosen Emma specifically, recognizing something in the infant that would allow her to serve as a bridge between worlds? Or had it been chance, a random confluence of events that had created an opening for magic to enter the mundane world? The answer, Emma had come to believe, didn't really matter. What mattered was that it had happened, that she had been given a gift and a responsibility that she had tried to honor. What mattered was that the world was vast and mysterious and full of consciousness and forms humanity was only beginning to recognize. What mattered was that the barriers between human and nature, between self and other, were more fluid than anyone had imagined, and that in that fluidity lay the possibility of healing not just individuals, but the world itself. As her life drew to a close, Emma made one final visit to the clearing. It was autumn, the forest painted in shades of gold and red, the air crisp with the promise of coming winter. She sat where she had been found as a baby, where she had returned as a teenager, where she had stood as a researcher and teacher. The clearing was quiet, peaceful, ordinary to any casual observer. But Emma could feel the layers of history there, the echoes of all the consciousness that had touched this place. She closed her eyes and reached out with senses that science couldn't quite explain, but that she had learned to trust. She felt the presence of the animals nearby, watching, waiting. She felt the trees, ancient witnesses to everything that had transpired. She felt the earth itself, holding the memory of every creature that had found healing here. And for just a moment, she felt something else, a familiar presence, warm and protective, impossible but undeniable. The bear, or the spirit of the bear, or perhaps the consciousness that the bear had embodied, was still there, still watching, still protecting. Emma smiled, understanding finally that the story had no ending because it was part of a larger story that had been going on since consciousness first emerged in the universe. The healing circles, the consciousness networks, the impossible connections between species. They were all expressions of something fundamental, something that would continue long after she and everyone who remembered the original events were gone. Her role had been to help make it visible, to give it language that humans could begin to understand. But the real work, the deep magic of consciousness recognizing itself across difference, that would continue with or without human participation. As she opened her eyes and prepared to leave the clearing for the last time, Emma saw a young bear at the forest's edge, watching her with eyes that seemed familiar. It was probably a descendant of her protector, carrying perhaps some genetic memory of that long-ago morning. Or perhaps it was just a bear, curious about the old woman sitting alone in the woods. But as their eyes met, Emma felt again that spark of recognition, that moment of consciousness touching consciousness across the vast divide of species. She nodded, a gesture of gratitude and farewell, and the bear disappeared into the forest. Walking back through the woods, Emma thought about all the people who would come after her, the researchers who would build on her work, the children who would grow up in a world where interspecies consciousness was accepted fact rather than fantasy, the future generations who might achieve the full communion with nature that she had only glimpsed. She thought about the clearing, protected now but still vulnerable to the pressures of a changing world. She thought about the bears and all the other creatures who carried wisdom that humanity was only beginning to appreciate. Her final paper, published posthumously, was titled simply The Gift. In it, she wrote about her experience not as a scientific phenomenon to be studied, but as a gift that had been given to humanity through her, the gift of knowing that consciousness was everywhere, that healing was possible across any divide, that the world was far more magical and interconnected than most people dared to believe. She ended with a call not for more research, but for more openness, more willingness to see the consciousness in every living thing and to honor it. The paper sparked controversy, as she had known it would. Some saw it as the culmination of a brilliant career, a final statement from someone who had revolutionized understanding of animal consciousness. Others saw it as an unfortunate descent into mysticism from someone who should have remained grounded in empirical science. But for those who had experienced their own moments of interspecies connection, who had felt the presence of intelligence in nature that couldn't be measured or quantified, it was validation and inspiration. The clearing remains today, unmarked and officially unrecognized, but known to those who seek it. People still report unusual experiences there, moments of profound peace, encounters with unusually calm wildlife, the sensation of being part of something larger than themselves. Scientists continue to study it, finding new anomalies with each advance in technology. Indigenous elders include it in their prayers, recognizing it as one of the places where the spirit world touches the physical. And occasionally, very occasionally, someone reports seeing a bear there, watching over the space with ancient, knowing eyes. The research station that Emma established has become a global center for consciousness studies, attracting scientists, philosophers, and seekers from around the world. Her descendants continue the work, each generation adding new understanding while maintaining the core insight that consciousness is not limited to humans, but is a fundamental aspect of life itself. The healing circles may be rare now, but the understanding they represented has spread, influencing everything from conservation policy to educational philosophy. And somewhere in forests around the world, in places humans rarely go, the healing continues. Bears and other creatures gather in circles that defy explanation. Traumatized animals find peace, and the ancient wisdom of nature expresses itself in ways that science is only beginning to glimpse. The story of Emma and the bear was never just about one miraculous encounter, but about the possibility such encounters represent, the possibility that humanity might remember its place in the community of consciousness, might learn to listen to the wisdom of other species, might find healing in the recognition of awareness wherever it exists.